Hi there, my name's Luke. I'm part of the leadership of G2 and today in our small groups we're going to be looking at Matthew 19, and it's one of those passages where you kind of almost hope you could not go into it. It's a difficult topic today, it's a difficult thing to look at, but we're committed to looking at all of the Bible, not just the bits we like. And so this might be a difficult one today because we're looking at divorce. And I just want to start by recognizing that that is not a simple topic. I want to reassure you that we'll look at this today coming from a place of compassion, a place of love, a place of patience, and not a place of judgment. If you were aware that today we're going to be looking at the subject of divorce and what Jesus says on this topic in the passage in Matthew 19, you might have thought to yourself, I don't want to engage in that. I'm not going to go along. It could be painful for many people. Divorce has meant a huge amount of pain. It could be one that you were part of. It might be one that you was affected. You were affected by when you were a child, perhaps your parents or another person's parents or someone else in the family. It can be very messy. It isn't always, but it can be. The fallout from it is often far-reaching, and the effects are felt for many years. Equally, it is crucial that we look at this for that reason, because it does affect so many people in our culture today. But I just want to remind us that Jesus is kind, he is loving, he's trustworthy, he's compassionate, and he is good. And so we can look at this together as a community in an agreement that we're not going to judge one another for anything that we've experienced, anything we have chosen to do in the past, or anything we might currently believe. We're not in a place to judge one another. My dad was married before. He was married to my mum, and they chose to tell me and my sister that. My sister is 4 years younger than me. They decided to tell us when she was 10 and I was 14. They wanted to wait until we were both old enough to be able to understand about that. And that was pretty difficult for us both to hear. We didn't know anything about the fact that Dad had been married before until they told us at that point. And I guess as a 14-year-old, that was quite a lot of life had happened really, and before until that had happened. So I found that difficult to hear. My sister probably found that harder to hear. And the story behind it had been that my dad had been married to someone who had cheated on him regularly and a lot ever since they were married. And they were married for 5 years, and Dad had continually tried to bring healing to that relationship and tried to fix it, but that wasn't going to be possible, and eventually she left him. And so he sought divorce on the grounds of adultery. Interestingly, even though Jesus specifically outlines in this passage we're about to read that is the only grounds in which he says that's okay for a divorce to happen, the church at the time still wouldn't remarry anyone in a church. If they'd been divorced before, you couldn't get married in a church. So when my mum and dad were engaged and were wanting to get married, my mum's dad was a vicar, and they wanted him to marry them, but they couldn't find a church that was going to allow that to happen. So they had to get special permission from the bishop in order to let that happen. And so he broke the Church of England's laws in order to do that. So they did get married in a church, but it was, I think, potentially the first time that had happened. That was in 1977. That might have been the first time that had happened in a Church of England church, where someone who had been married before was married in a church for a second time. It is now legal in the Church of England for that to happen. which is very good that that's gone through, and it's something that my parents spoke about publicly, and my dad, he's died now, but when my dad was on General Synod of the Church of England, he also spoke about that, and my mum also did. But it was very difficult to hear about the fact that he had been married before and divorced and all. There was clearly a whole story and a side to that I was unaware of, and it's painful, very painful for him to go through. So I wanted to tell you that to start with, just saying that's probably my closest experience of divorce. But I wonder for you, what are your experiences of divorce? When you take a minute, maybe take a good little chunk now just to chat through what have your experiences been of divorce, and be as honest as you feel you can be, knowing that there's no judgment here. Be real with one another. Have integrity. Share what it has been like. Has it been painful for you? Have you experienced it yourself? Maybe your parents. Don't overshare if you don't feel comfortable sharing. That's okay. But I just want to encourage you that it's a safe environment to be able to do that. It's a really good environment, in fact, to be able to do this in a small group. So go for that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and read the passage together. Okay, so you are going to read the passage together in just a moment, which is Matthew 19, 1-9. So you grab your Bibles, make sure you've got it up in front of you in whatever format you're going to be looking at that. So we're going to read that together in just a minute, and we'll press pause on here and you can read it together. But just to give you a bit of context in terms of the environment and the sort of setting that Jesus is saying this in. It is a tense Middle Eastern environment. The politics of the day are complex. I mean, it's in Israel, it's Roman occupied. There's all sorts of other influences and political persuasions that are going on. Lots of the Jews don't agree on what is happening and how do they interpret the fact that what was prophesied in the Old Testament, in the Torah, they don't seem to be able to reconcile that with the reality that they're sitting in, oppressed by another people. So there's people who want to rise up and get rid of the Romans and throw off the oppression and live in a free Israel state. And then there are people who want more the sort of conservative angle of Judaism, and then there's a more liberal angle of that as well, and people are looking to different rabbis for what should we do and who should we believe. So at the time, and this is referenced, by the way, in the series The Chosen, which is fantastic. If you've never watched The Chosen, please spend time watching The Chosen. Get the app, you can watch it on YouTube, I think. But make sure you watch The Chosen. It's such a good dramatization of Jesus and his disciples particularly. Anyway, so at the time, there's two contrasting rabbis who are either end of the spectrum. You've got Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. And Rabbi Hillel is very liberal, and he is up for people doing all sorts of stuff. He's like, this is very basic in terms of its interpretation, but he effectively says you can do what you like. So he's saying, yeah, you can get divorced to whoever you want. You can play the book, as it were. You can make life work for you, and particularly for Jewish men. So he's at the sort of liberal end of the spectrum, and he's saying you can do as you want. Then you've got Shammai, and he is very conservative. He is a Pharisee. He is like very, what's the right word? He's pretty tight on how he would have the rules followed. And he says, you do as you're told. So you've got these two, he's saying you can't marry lots of different people, but it's a controversial issue. And if you were to summarize it, and it is a little bit of a basic summary, but it's probably helpful, and it speaks into how so much of our culture is today. You have Hillel saying you can do as you want, and you've got Shammai saying do as you're told. And I think that speaks into our culture right now. You've got people in lots of different areas, but also in the area of relationships, marriage, and all the rest of it. You've got people going, do whatever you want, Your life is yours to do with whatever you want. You can just get on with it and make it work and find a scripture to back it up. And you've got people saying, do as you're told. The Bible says, thou shalt not, and you should get in line, basically. And Jesus speaks into that context and doesn't pick either. But the people who ask him this question about divorce are trying to get him to go one way or the other. They're trying to pin him down to which side of this argument does he sit on which side. So is it this way or is it that way? Is it him or is it him? And they're constantly providing him with that decision. And that's what most people are living in. And Jesus' response is to look at both of these and to say, neither. I look to heaven. And that is the response for me that would summarize Jesus' response in so many different settings and to so many different conundrums. His response is to say, is it this or this? Tell you what, it's probably a different way. Let's look to heaven. Let's not look to him or him. Let's not look earthbound. Let's not look to liberal or conservative. Let's look to heaven. And there's a different perspective that comes in at this point. So Jesus takes them right back to Genesis. He goes, okay, so you want to play the Deuteronomy game of finding a rule or whatever? I'll tell you what, let's go right back to Genesis, to the plan of how it was created. So see what you can spot. Read the passage together. We've got Matthew 19 verses 1. Do you know what? You might as well go all the way to 12. I think it was given as 1 to 9, but go all the way to 12. And you can read it in different versions if you like, and then press play again when you've finished and when you're ready. Right back to how you were created, like man and woman, and a man leaving his wife and a man not leaving his wife, a man leaving his family and joining his wife. What a Freudian slip that was. So he raises them to a higher standard. What's really interesting here is there's a couple of things I'm going to pull out. There's marriage as consumerism that Jesus is challenging, and he's wanting to remind people about marriage as covenant, as a picture of how God has promised to the church and to the Jewish people before that commitment, undying commitment. But so Jesus wants to speak into this. Quite often when Jesus is asked questions, tricky things, and someone's trying to trip him up, he avoids speaking about it, and he finds a way of not answering directly. He finds a way of telling a story or flipping it back on someone or holding up the mirror to them, and he's a genius at that. In this instance, he wants to speak into marriage. So that's interesting. Why is that the case? Well, there's at this point of time, there is a consumer attitude towards marriage that is going on, and it's particularly male dominated, and females are being oppressed in this setting. So he wants to speak into the commitment that marriage is about. He wants to address the abusive behavior that lots of the Jewish men were partaking in at the time, and he wants to address the injustice that has created. So there's male power over women. Divorce has allowed women to be treated like objects even more than they were anyway. So Deuteronomy 24:1 says that a man can divorce his wife if he finds any indecency in her. Well, that's so open to interpretation, and Moses gives that ruling basically because the people who he's leading through the wilderness are coming out of 400 years of slavery, during which they have been oppressed and have been, they've basically forgotten how to be human in that time. They've been slaves and captives, and they've kind of forgotten their values, their core values. So out of their hard-heartedness that was created because of that setting, Moses gives them a leniency in ruling to say, if you find something indecent in your wife, you can divorce her. So it's kind of come out of this specific setting of those people coming out 400 years of slavery and wanting to going into the promised land but not yet being there, and Moses giving them some ruling around how they are to be people again, and to help them function again. But that does create a difference from the Genesis version of God creating man and woman, and God, and the whole thing of whatever God has put together, let no man separate. By the way, the word in that passage, let no man separate, and we say that in our marriage ceremonies today, don't we? The word used is not the same word for male, as in like Adam. It's the word that's used for humankind. So it's just saying what God has put together, let no humans separate. But obviously, it's worth being clear on that, isn't it? Because especially if you're talking about a male dominant thing, let no man separate. Anyway, so it's let no humans separate. But Jesus takes it to another gear. He takes it to another level. So he's been given this whole dilemma of, well, yeah, I know God put it together, but then again, Moses says in certain settings you can. And that was open to so much abuse. And lots of men were divorcing their wives for things like the fact that they burnt their cooking. Well, that's indecent. A wife should be able to do that. Or they've had an argument because the woman had a difference of opinion. He says that's indecent for a woman to have a different opinion for me, so I'm going to divorce her. And that is a complete abuse of power that is never going to be in the heart of God. So it's a consumer attitude to divorce that is being challenged, and Jesus says that's no good. So he takes it to another level and says, if you think about the don't commit adultery thing, he does this all the time. He says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say to you, anyone who looks at a woman commits adultery. And obviously it's the same for the other way around. For anyone who looks at a man commits adultery if you do that in your head. So he takes it to the next level, and people weren't expecting to hear that when he goes back to Genesis and speaks about it in that way. He's like, this is not an acceptable thing to do. Now, it's difficult for us to read that in our culture, to read something that says it's not okay to get divorced in any other grounds other than adultery, because it makes us feel, but surely all of the people I know who have had divorce, and maybe you've been part of one as well, and you've gone through divorce, and you think, surely that's all right, and Jesus is telling me I'm wrong. And it's one of those difficult things to read. But I think that we are missing the point if we go into the small minutiae of exactly he just says that, therefore it's black and white and bish bash bosh. You've got to look at the bigger picture. And this is what Jesus does when he says you can look at Hillel or Shammai, or you can look higher up and deeper and broader. That is what Jesus does in all of his teachings, whether it's to the teachers of the law or his own disciples or whoever. And they need to keep coming back. The disciples afterwards go, just run that by us again. We don't really get this. Who can get married then? Or who can get divorced? What's the deal? And he's constantly saying, look higher up to God from his perspective. He'll give you a bigger parameter of what you can see. Look broader. There's always more there than you think. And look deeper. There's more going on underneath than you can think. And he does that with his teaching. So he takes it to the next level, and it's a challenge. And he says, if you are able to hear this, let people hear this. But not everyone is going to be able to hear it. Yes, so his challenge ups the game, doesn't it, around adultery? It certainly does for all of us. And he said, and he didn't come to just clean up our beds. He came up to clean up our heads. I've heard that said a few times. He's not just interested in has anybody actually slept with anyone? He's saying, no, it goes way further than that. What's going on in your minds and in your hearts? That's where purity really goes on. So the Greek word for sexual immorality is porneia, which is obviously where we get our word pornography from. And it doesn't refer just to adultery specifically, as in somebody actually having extramarital sex with another person. But that is the word that is used here in this passage when Jesus says any reason for divorce would be adultery, sexual immorality. It's porneia that is used. So it's anything that, you would only be on that grounds. Now, on that grounds, anyone can get a divorce, can't they? So this is partly what causes the confusion, because everybody, if you are married, your spouse at some point will have had some sort of thoughts about somebody else. And if that's what, if that's the ground for divorce, then anybody can do it. But in the same kind of line of who's going to cast the first stone, he ups the ante and challenges those who are listening. And what he's really trying to do is saying the problem here is people have got a consumer attitude to divorce. So the people going, but surely it's all right because Moses said it's okay. And he's like, well, he did say it's okay for that specific reason. But the reason you're wanting to be okay with that ruling is because you want permission to divorce whoever you want, so you can move on and get married to whoever you want, because you want to do whatever you can want. And then you've got other people who are saying, well, you mustn't do it because you must follow the rules. And he's saying, but if you just follow the rules and you're just going black and white and simplistic the whole time, you're missing all the depth and color and texture and breadth of everything that there is to take in. And God has to teach us in this setting. So he's challenging the consumer attitude to marriage. And I think that is something for us today to really look into, because it's fair to say in today's culture there is still a consumer attitude to when a man and a woman are married. When does that what is it that breaks that up? And we're in such a consumer world where our worldview we're taught that that's so important and everything, that it's difficult for us to see that it could be wrong for somebody to divorce just on the grounds of they just didn't get on anymore. But I think this passage is showing there's much more to it than that. And he wants firstly to say, don't just be consumer about it. So have a chat in your group right now about that consumer attitude thing. Perhaps there's something I said around the Hillel and the Shammai, the this way and the that way, instead of looking to a much broader picture. Maybe it's something around the word porneia, cleaning up not just our beds, but also our heads. Have a chat about the consumer attitude to marriage that Jesus speaks into. And then we're going to come back and look at marriage as a covenant and the connection that has to the church, the picture that it is for the church. Okay, go for it. Good stuff. I hope you're having helpful conversations in your groups. The final thing that I'm going to speak on is just marriage as covenant. And it can be quite straightforward. Jesus is wanting to highlight the importance of this thing that's going on with the controversy around divorce, and he's wanting to speak into it because of how important a picture it is of the marriage between a man and a woman is such an important picture for God and his people. And you could read the book of Hosea to see that illustrated in terms of commitment. In fact, that book is quite a good challenge to anyone saying, let's get divorced because there's been some infidelity that's happened. But really, that's a picture of how God sees his people, and that is the issue. And it's about long-term, undying, faithful commitment, an unbreakable bond between God and his people. And he's saying, if you just allow divorce to happen all over the place for whatever different kind of small reasons, you are saying that you have missed, you haven't understood the illustration, the long-term promise that God has with his people. And when a man and a woman are married, they make those promises together. They say, until death do us part. There isn't anything else that's going to get between us in sickness and in health. No matter what sort of turbulence we go through, we are committing to one another forever. And that is a picture of God and his people. So if that is messed around with, and if it becomes culturally okay, or within the church it becomes acceptable, and in this instance within the Jewish community, if it becomes acceptable to just divorce people for all sorts of different reasons, then it completely spoils that picture, and it will affect people's relationship with God because they don't know that he's not committed to them. Maybe he just gets rid of us whenever we've had enough, or whenever he's had enough of us. Or maybe we decide to follow Jesus and then it doesn't suit us anymore. So we stop being Christians and just bin it off because we fancy doing something else. But there's a commitment that's long term here. And the fact that God will never let us go is all part of that. Having said all that, I want you to be able to be free to explore this passage finally, and to say, where do you think this lands? What does it speak to you about? And I've given you some of that context. There's a bit of teaching in there, but I'm wanting to avoid going, here's a black and white, right and wrong answer here, because I recognize that there is so much texture and complexity to this issue. It is one of the issues in which Jesus is bizarrely very straightforward. He often isn't, and he is here. And I think it's got to be something to do with the picture of the church and the picture of God's relationship with people. Nevertheless, there is always much more room. So if we come back to where we began, remember he's good, remember he's kind, remember we don't judge one another, remember we're loving and only because he loved us first. So in that context, I'd like you to see where this lands, and then I'd love you to pray for one another.